Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm talking with Amity Shlaes. Amity is the author of 4 New York Times bestsellers, which include The Forgotten Man, New History of the Great Depression, and Coolidge, which is a full-length biography of our 30th president in the United States. Amity is on the board of the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation, which she's the chairwoman of. She is also the winner of the Hayek Prize and currently chairs a jury for the prize, sponsored by the Manhattan Institute. She serves as the presidential scholar at King's College, where she teaches on Coolidge. And prior to that, she also taught at New York University's Stern School of Business. She has written for the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, and Bloomberg, and also in Forbes and in the National Review. In this conversation, we talk about Calvin Coolidge. I am very, very much interested in United States history, and I love U.S. presidents. And so I remember reading her book on Coolidge many, many years ago when it came out, and I recently reread it. And so I was thrilled when she agreed to come on and talk about Calvin Coolidge. He's someone that doesn't get talked about a lot, and I wanted to kind of get his legacy and what he did as president, and most people don't know about him, and so she's the person to do it. And so we talk all about Calvin Coolidge. We start by talking about his background and his environment and how he was raised in a household and raised in a place where he was very frugal with money. He was very fiscally conservative, and she talks about some of the reasons why that was the case. We talk about his path and rise to the presidency. He had a very particular path to the presidency. It wasn't abnormal necessarily, but it was very particular and thought out. And we talk about that. We discuss this idea of him being a progressive or holding some of the progressive ideals of the time for his state, but how that was not necessarily mapping on at the national level. So he wasn't a part of the Progressive Party necessarily, but he was somebody that did believe for his state or his local community certain progressive elements, which was an interesting discussion we had on that. We talk about the emphasis that Coolidge had as president to balance the budget and reduce the debt, and why that was his emphasis. Many times presidents, when they come into office, they are, they have a certain demeanor or a certain way in which they want to lead, or certain projects that they want to do. And his was, very much financial. And so she explains why that was the case for him. We talk about his handling of the Mississippi floods. And, he gets a lot of criticism for that. And this is kind of the, if you can think of Hurricane Katrina, this was, times, 3, back when this happened. And so he gets a lot of criticism for not involving the national government to provide aid. And so we talk a little bit about that. And we talk about one of his areas of weakness, which would probably be foreign affairs. And then finally, we discuss the legacy of Calvin Coolidge and where he sits kind of within the pantheon of other U.S. presidents and just as a statesman. This was a great, great conversation. I was very, very happy to get someone that is an expert on a person. She obviously runs the foundation and she's written a biography, and I was very proud to talk to her about Calvin Coolidge and about him as president. And so I now bring you Amity Shlaes. I'm here with Amity Shlaes. Amity, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I greatly appreciate it.
Glad to be here.
So I'm excited to talk to you about President Calvin Coolidge. He's someone that most people, don't know a lot about. And you've written a great biography, which is, I guess, almost 10 years old now, right? It's Coolidge, is the name of the biography. Is that right? About 10 years old.
Yes, sir. Just about. Almost.
Yeah. I've read it a few times. It's very good.
Thank you.
Just tell folks real quick who you are, what you do, and anything you're currently working on.
Well, thank you for having me. My name is Amity Shlaes. I'm the chairman of the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation. The purpose of the foundation is to expose Calvin Coolidge's life, to share it with Americans, particularly young Americans, and also to expose his values. He was an interesting president. He's underrated. So that's what we do at the foundation, and that is my main job.
Yeah. How long have you been doing that? You've been doing that for quite a long time now, right?
Quite a long. I've been involved with Coolidge with the foundation for a similar amount of time, about a decade.
Wow. Nice. Very, very nice. So I want to talk about Coolidge. We can just do some brief background stuff and then really just kind of focus on the presidency, which is always super interesting to me. When I was reading your biography on him, one of the main themes that comes up in the book, kind of from his early childhood and, kind of throughout his time as he was on his ascendancy to the presidency and as president, was this idea of or emphasis on fiscal conservatism, right? And some people might say, he was very frugal. He was, a penny pincher, all that stuff. Do you think his major contributing factors to this in his early life? Was this a, temperament, personality thing? Was this parenting, his family life, or kind of a mix of both?
Well, there's a personal part to it, which is he comes from a farming community and a tough farming community, Plymouth Notch, Vermont. The humorist Will Rogers later said that in Vermont, the farms don't lay, they hang. That is, it's not very even there. And other people say in Vermont, you farm rocks. People who want to be farmers moved away from Vermont by and large pretty early out to the more forgiving plains, which they rearranged and, made America's breadbasket. So farmers don't have much money. They're speculators in a way. They have to borrow to plant, and hopefully they recoup and profit in the fall. They have food, but not money. And the Coolidges were not pure farmers. Father Coolidge had a store. He was sheriff. He was involved in the politics, the town meeting, and in politics of the state. They did a lot of things. They were a country squire would be too grand a term, but let's say town squire. That was Father Coolidge, John Coolidge, the father of the president, and the grandfather too. So they were not poor, but they didn't have a lot of cash. And if you grow up non-poor with a lot of cash, you pay a lot of attention to what happens with cash. So there's that, but there's also the fact that Coolidge was operating in a different world. You think about England where people drive on the other side of the road. Well, that's sort of the way a gold standard economy is. It's just a different set of rules to what we follow or observe now with economics. If a country went into deficit, it had gold. It was gold standard. Its currency was based upon gold. The gold went over the ocean to England. And that forced a contraction of the U.S. economy. So the U.S. budget kind of had to be in balance, or a contraction, recession, would be forced upon the economy. And the politician in charge at the given moment when that occurred would be blamed. So it's sort of like a state government now. You can get a little bit of a feel for it that way. A state government that is more in deficit than its neighbors has a lower bond rating and has to pay more money to borrow that state than its solvent neighbor. So think of America as more like a U.S. state. U.S. states have problems when they go in deficit. So Coolidge wanted the government to save because he operated in this world. He didn't want to be responsible for forcing the United States into a recession through a monetary contraction. There's that too. It was just a different world. You think about if you've ever seen Mary Poppins,
yes.
When they sing about the beauty of compounding, that beauty is real. And I think Americans and Victorians alike understood that. And one thing that makes compounding especially worthwhile is when the money holds its value. So that was a factor too. So think of it as Coolidge's own experience from a frugal background. Farmers never had much money. Don't believe they ever will, is what Coolidge said. And then also the political economy and the construct of our national finance.
Yeah, so it's really helpful because it kind of is a major theme I see through his life. And so it would make sense that if he's coming from that background, that he would that's a kind of grid that he's coming out of, and he sees that.
Well, you think of the U.S. and the U.K. The U.S. did better because it was closer to solvent than the U.K. in that period. Nations went down over their debts.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, we live in we're like a Michelin man, all padded, because we're the world's currency. We're the so-called currency of reserve. And even when we do wrong, somehow we get rewarded. Nothing bad ever happens to us, no matter how much money we spend. Well, that was not the U.S. of that period. It wasn't clear the U.S. was the currency of reserve. Our money walked away pretty fast if people didn't like our economy, and that did force those contractions. So Coolidge was pretty aware of that, as any American would be at the time. Just also, I use the analogy of a state, but think of a business that's insolvent. You know that pretty soon, if your business is insolvent, it will fail.
Yeah.
So that was his entire experience as an attorney, as an adult, in addition to his formation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that kind of goes to my next question, which was, he had a pretty unique rise to the presidency. I mean, some people, it's kind of a lawyer, then you're a senator, and then, president. That's a common pathway. But his was interesting. It was, he did a lot of local government, city council, solicitor, clerk of courts, legislator, state senator, and then all the way up to lieutenant governor and then governor of Massachusetts. And then VP and then the president. Is there anything... Do you think that was intentional on his part, that he wanted to stay local government for a while, or was he just kind of following where things led him, and he just said, you know what, this is a good move right now, or was it kind of scripted out in his mind? How do you see?
Well, there are two answers to that very useful question. The first is that Coolidge had a professor. Young people have great anxiety about stepping out of university into the world. Mm-hmm. One sees it all the time. Oh, I didn't step into the right job. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. They look around for the optimal job, and they take psychology tests and they study themselves. And what Coolidge's teacher said was, it doesn't really matter. Life is a river. A career is a river. It doesn't really matter how or where you get in. You just sort of have to hold to the center, and you'll float along, and you'll find your way. And if you stay at the center and keep going, you'll find you'll become a man of power, was the phrase they use. And that is the way careers work. You kind of happen into stuff, and then you happen into more stuff, which doesn't sound logical to a 22-year-old who says, I'm interested in urban planning and I'm interested in the Southwest. Therefore, I need an urban planning job in the Southwest and a certain kind of car to go with that. Mm-hmm. Life is much more random than that. It has to do with affinities and who one meets. But the second thing about Coolidge is, so Coolidge did that with the Republican Party in Massachusetts, which was then a more powerful state. He stepped in and tried to make himself useful. He didn't say, I want that job. He had a philosophy: if you do well enough in the job you're in, people will notice you and promote you. Mm-hmm. Interesting. A good question whether that's still true, but that was his philosophy. Yeah. The second thing was the nature of the Republican Party, or any party in that period, which was different to today, just as the monetary regime and rules were different. The GOP made its people. It trained them and raised them up all the way to Washington. And the Democrats did too. There was populism then, that is, outsiders who came in and overcame the party. But the party was also, I would say, stronger. And this was before the 17th Amendment, to the Constitution, which elects senators by popular vote. In those days, when Coolidge was growing up, he was born in 1872. Who picked senators? State legislatures. Mm-hmm. Who did they pick? They picked somebody they knew, not a first impression, maybe a 50th impression, right? Who are they going to give that privilege of going to Washington being a senator? Someone they really liked or they really understood was powerful. So it wasn't a first impression culture. It was a friend culture, a knowledge culture. The negative side of that is if there was corruption, it might be institutional in the party. Yeah. Enemies of Coolidge said he climbed the greasy pole of Republican politics. There's something to that. He just kept climbing. But the other part of it is, since they all knew each other pretty well, they could weed out who was a faker. They can weed out the fakers who didn't do the work. So those are the two factors. Coolidge thought he might be a Republican. Most Coolidges were. Massachusetts was a Republican state in many ways. You can see. Well, he was going to be a Republican and party of Lincoln, and he just did the work, and the party recognized that. Why is that different to now? Because he wasn't on TV. He didn't even have to give speeches always in every session. Sometimes the party just agreed he was the candidate, and the loyal voters, what we would call machine, voted the ticket. Yeah. And his name was on the ticket. So very different to today. His mentor was a guy named Murray Crane, a senator, one of the early heads at Crane, the stationery company. If you see Crane Stationery, C-R-A-N-E, but the Cranes also printed the dollar. And people in Massachusetts still know a plant that what's called the government plant because it was the Crane plant that printed the US dollar. So the Cranes were a mighty family. People used paper a lot in those days. Think of the Emily Dickinson world, right? Poet. And Murray Crane was kind of a quiet guy. He didn't give a lot of speeches, but he did his job well. And in the pre-17th Amendment world, that was often enough. In fact, talking was suspect because it might be false advertising, over-promising. Life was not all marketing. So again, that's a bit far from where we are, and I think it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, no, it's interesting to see the progression. It sounds like Coolidge definitely was a party man. He was somebody that was adhering to what the party was saying, and they liked him, and they he just climbed that pole is a very nice way of saying it.
Well, today we consider loyalty suspect, stupid, tribal in a negative way. Loyal people don't think it through. They're not independent. They don't have integrity, but there's an integrity to loyalty as well.
Sure.
So again, it's a sort of different way of thinking, like driving on the other side of the road that we're not used to, but that doesn't mean it's entirely wrong. And today's way of driving in politics or in monetary is absolutely right.
Yeah. It's just wildly different now. It's sometimes it's very hard, I think, for people to, when they're reading about these figures or certain past presidents and how the party's changed and stuff, both parties have changed. It's kind of hard to take off the glasses we have for today's politics. I wanted to ask about kind of in the early years, as state senator and stuff, he was pretty sympathetic to the progressive movement at the time. He was for women's suffrage, school reform, antitrust, state income tax, minimum wage for women workers, salary increases for teachers, etc. And we see him evolve kind of away from this. And was this something that the Republican Party kind of evolved away from, or was this more of him personally? How did this evolution happen where he wasn't really a progressive by the time he gets to be president? And, how do you think that kind of evolution happened for him?
The party was progressive. He was in the party. It was the party of Theodore Roosevelt. When Coolidge, there's such a thing as a state progressive versus a federal progressive. And their progressivism meant in Massachusetts, we pass a law about women's labor or about a minimum wage for Massachusetts, states' rights. And he was for the individual. So Coolidge understood that women's suffrage, as they called it in the singular, oddly, gave people the vote, and that wasn't a bad idea, even if those people happened to be women. He felt the same way about African Americans, right? But he was a state progressive. As a state progressive in Massachusetts, he observed a number of things. One is sometimes progressive projects worked, and they were more rational, less corrupt in the old machine way. It was progressive to cut the government by rationalizing it. Right? Scientific approach to government, professionalizing. Two was progressives passed a lot of laws, and that didn't always seem productive. He said, give administration a chance to catch up with legislation before you judge it. And, the impulse to pass laws upon laws can be counterproductive. And he didn't like the outcomes of some of the progressivism. He certainly didn't like the rise of public sector unions. He didn't think that was productive. He thought if one chooses to work for the government, well, one is a public servant, then one should not work against the interest of the public. And demanding a very high raise, well, that means that the taxpayer must pay more, and maybe one oughtn't do that if one chooses to serve the public as a policeman or teacher. That was the logic he had. He thought a lot about service. He was certainly foregoing wages himself by being a state lawmaker instead of being an attorney. He trained as an attorney. He was a good attorney. He probably could have made a much better living. Coolidge didn't even have a mortgage as a young man before, at any point before the presidency, because he didn't want to be beholden to anyone. Mm-hmm. That would compromise him politically. He wanted people to be beholden to him. Mm. So he deposited in a lot of different banks. So right. Then when he gets to Washington, he's got some views about state progressivism, sort of mixed, but that didn't mean he wanted Washington national progressivism. Mm. That offended federalism. Mm. It was the notion that it's states where these experiments should take place, and then we'll, have a lot of experiments, and we'll see how we like the result. But it was another thing to have Washington impose expensive laws. So so I think it was a combo, sir, of experience as a state progressive and distinguishing between state and federal progressivism that made him look like far less of a progressive as president.
It's interesting. I think that's an important distinction, because if I'm understanding you right, you're basically saying that, sure, some states may have an element of progressivism for their state, but that doesn't mean that it needs to scale up to the entire federal government, where every single state needs to do it the exact same way. Even if they are, good things, obviously women's suffrage and, antitrust and stuff like that. Those may be good things, but allowing the ability for each state to make their kind of decision on if they want to or not want to do something like that.
It's progressivism versus federalism, two principles that also there was a sort of disaster in the world of Coolidge, though he was never willing to characterize it as such. And that disaster was called Theodore Roosevelt. Because Roosevelt, there he was, progressive president, and then, Roosevelt's out, and then Roosevelt runs, and he splits the party, and that infuriates Coolidge. I don't have a whole lot of evidence of that, but my surmise, looking at his mood, is that because the party lost. When you split the party out of ego, who wins? Woodrow Wilson. The other side. Wait a minute. And you can see from Coolidge's letters as a young lawmaker to his father, who am I running against? Am I running against a Bull Moose person, a Theodore Roosevelt person, or am I running against a Democrat? And why am I having to primary with this other group? So his sense as a party man, and this can be traced directly to Edmund Burke, I think, in terms of tradition, though Coolidge is not a big Burkean explicit, is that the party is important and parties give us benefits. And if you break up the party, you better have a good reason to do so. Party continuity is important. So he was pretty furious at rabble rousers. And in Washington, when he became president, the party was splintering. So there it was again after World War I as well.
Yeah. The reference you made there is the election of 1912 for listeners, and where Teddy Roosevelt.
Yes, well, he's still a young man in politics. Coolidge became governor around the end of World War I, but before that, he was president of the Bay State Senate, and he was mayor of Northampton, and he was in the House of Massachusetts. So he had just virtually every job, and that was tough.
Yeah. I want to just kind of go straight to the presidency now. I mean, we could talk about him as governor and as VP, but I want to go to presidency. So Harding dies of a heart attack, and Coolidge finishes his term, so he becomes the 30th president, and he was president just under 6 years. So he finished out Harding's term and then was elected on his own right and did 4 years. And the main focus for Coolidge was, in finishing Harding's term at least, was the budget. He wanted to bring debt down, cut taxes, reduce government. We've already talked about his rise and how he did this, previously, and, some of the stuff in his own life. And do you think the motivation and main focus on the debt and cutting taxes, was driven by some of his personal kind of lens and grid he was coming out of, or also, now when we're looking at the federal government, it's like, okay, there's certain things states can do, but in terms of the federal government, what it should do, why do you think this was like his first or his main thing was the budget and taxes and reducing government? Why was that his big thing?
We talked about temperament, but it was really the party said very explicitly that taxation was too heavy. There was heavy taxation in the wake of with Wilson, and therefore business was on strike. One, tax rates were too high and revenues were disappointing. And the U.S. had sort of gained purchase of the position of number one in the world with World War I, but there was no guarantee we would keep that first place. And Americans knew it. We had an enormous debt subsequent to World War I, notwithstanding the war bonds and so on. In various ways we managed. Some of the debt was to ourselves with the war bonds, but we could slip back and not be number one anymore. And World War I was an awful sacrifice. One of the few things that made it feel a little better, that sacrifice, was the idea that the U.S. came out on top, right? That we had gained something, some advantage, that our culture had gained some advantage. So we better budget, that is, cut taxes and cut spending, or we might lose that position. And that was Harding's view, that was Coolidge's view, that was Andrew Mellon's view, the Treasury Secretary. It was Hoover's view, who followed Coolidge. Mellon was influential. He was, as I say, Treasury Secretary to these three presidents. And it was said of Mellon, he was sort of the Warren Buffett of the day, a very, very important financier and empire builder. It was said of him that three presidents served under him. That is, Mellon, the Treasury Secretary, was senior to his presidents in wisdom and capacity. So they all wanted to cut the budget. It happened that Coolidge's temperament was inclined that way as well. But Harding cut the budget and Coolidge cut the budget. And Hoover would have cut it further, if he hadn't come on hard times and it hadn't been cut so far already. They reduced the debt by 1/3. So think of a state that's strapped. Again, use the state model and has to move into austerity. That was the conviction of Republicans and many Democrats in the early 20s.
This is, I think, if I remember reading the book correctly, right, cut the debt by 1/3, which is pretty substantial, and even cut military spending, I believe, which is something that almost never happens really today, or at least in a way, in the same way. What can we learn about the lessons, I guess, from that period of this kind of, you're talking about three presidents that tried to, really get the debt under control and this kind of fiscal conservatism for the country. How can we take some of those things from that period, and Coolidge specifically, how could that maybe present or be done today in today's culture, I guess, or today's politics, rather?
Well, at Coolidge House, we have some pictures of the budget in the 20s. And what you'll find when you look at it, again, it's very different to our budget today in terms of the allocation. A much larger share is military, and there aren't many entitlements. That was not a concept yet, right? Yeah. That the federal government would pay for things. Coolidge vetoed generous pensions or what seemed to him generous pensions for vets. And in those days, a lot of people were vets, right? Because we had conscription. So that's something closer to Social Security than we imagine. He vetoed that. Sometimes such vetoes in that period were overridden, but he vetoed it. He vetoed agricultural subsidy, even though he did come from that challenging farm background. He did it. He just absolutely believed that it was important. They thought that the U.S. would be better off if vetoes occurred, if the government stepped back. And in fact, it was. What do I mean by that? Business was suffering under a big government. And, when the government receded, businesses grew and they employed people. The productivity gains that businesses achieved gave regular Americans big upgrades in their lives. They didn't get cell phones. It was a different era, but they got cars. The big change in life was you had a car. And you know how that is when you live in a place, you hate it until you get a car and you can drive around it when you're 16 years old. All of America got that. First through the Model T, then through the Model A. They also got something else. They used to work 6 days a week, often up until the 20s, but the productivity gains enabled by the prudent government suddenly made it possible for employers to have a 5-day work week. So they got something else we take for granted, Saturday.
Yeah.
People were, and they got indoor plumbing, for example. There's a book I used to have by a Wesleyan professor named Liebergott, where you look at all the things people got. And I think today in all our poverty discussions, what's the difference between abject poverty and working poor? Well, it's indoor plumbing. We discuss that for India. We discuss it for Appalachia. It's indoor plumbing. And then what comes after that? Phone, heat. Americans, indoor plumbing in that decade, the Coolidge decade, became the rule rather than the exception. And a lot of that progress was enabled by I won't say business promoting government. I would rather say business respecting government. Remember under Wilson and with the difficulties of the war, the U.S. intervened in the economy rather significantly. The main means of transport in that period, this was before trucks, for example, for industry was railroad. The government nationalized the railroad in World War I, or in the wake of it in that period. And so cutting back military spending was cutting back government. More than it would be today. We don't actually spend that much on the military today. We spend more on entitlements. If you look at, we tend to look at military spending as a share of GDP or a share of the budget. It was higher in terms of the budget in that period. What was the conception? Well, the conception was kind of something you will have heard from Reagan, City on a Hill. That is, if the United States grows, thrives, is happy, is a place people want to move to, that's good for the entire world too. The U.S. foreign policy, or, how does the U.S. help the world abroad? One way is it jumps in, gunboat diplomacy, which is effectively what we've had in Afghanistan, and it jumps out and then it jumps in again. Well, a lot of people wondered whether that was effective and whether it was beneficial to the little places where we were jumping in and out. Afghanistan, maybe it was better just for the U.S. to be strong and be a model. That was Coolidge's conception. And, Reagan always told this story of how someone, maybe a Russian dissident, told him the main thing the U.S. could do for the dissidents in Russia was be a model. Because as long as that model existed in the minds of Russian, change for freedom was a possibility. The U.S. isn't free, there's no model. City on a Hill, very, pilgrim, Puritan idea. Through example, we achieve much. Not neocon, to put it that way, not intervening. So I think that's an interesting model now in the context we're speaking in a month of this tragedy in Afghanistan. An interesting model. It could be conceived as disappointing. I think you could probably construe a case that had Coolidge spent more and the U.S. spent more in shipping, we would have been better prepared for Pearl Harbor, maybe, right? But on balance, it seemed to me a logical policy for a country exhausted after a giant and troubling engagement such as World War I. I mean, World War I was so awful, most people who came out of it didn't want to go in another war. They didn't think the trade-off wasn't there. Coolidge signed something called the Kellogg Pact, which outlawed war. And in graduate schools, it's a big habit to mock Kellogg brand, clever, But actually, Coolidge said, well, does it hurt to have an international treaty that out of law that we discourage war? And he spoke with Kellogg, his Secretary of State. And while they didn't think it hurt, it was good for the U.S. to turn to laws rather than arms. The the man who became Haile Selassie, the Ethiopian leader, was a kind of potentate, and he sent Coolidge a beautiful gold shield, very tribal, with lots of valuable gems in it, that's still in Plymouth Notch, Vermont, in the state storage center. And Coolidge sent back several law books. Law is better than gold. Did that help Haile Selassie when Mussolini invaded? Not particularly, right? Books are, but so you can argue this, but I think it's an interesting conception.
Yeah, it certainly is. You brought up the kind of the crisis in Afghanistan at the moment, and it's obviously very troubling. I was thinking about this reading the book about one of the major crises or crisis that Coolidge gets a lot of negative criticism on is the flooding in Mississippi and what happened there and how he handled it. And I guess if I was reading it correctly, he didn't necessarily want the federal government involved in aiding those who lost their homes and to livelihoods to a natural disaster. Is that about right? Or he wanted the state to kind of just figure it out, or am I
again,
wrong?
It's federalism versus progressivism, right? These words are difficult. Federalism means states' rights.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean big federal government. So the name, this always confused me when I was younger. Progressivism, the kind we're talking about here, is federal government progressivism, Washington progressivism.
Yeah.
As Coolidge called Washington the national government, because he didn't like that confusion. He was very careful with language. So he said, well, why should the federal government be in charge? Just because there's a natural disaster. The federal government can't handle all natural disasters. So if I go down to this awful flood, and it was awful, the flood of the Mississippi, then that will get more votes for federal spending on natural disasters. And I'm not sure I want to get into the infrastructure business. I'm not sure that's Washington's role. He's not alone in this. Think of Grover Cleveland, a Democrat, former governor of New York, who said federal aid in such cases encourages paternal care, a culture of paternal care from Washington. And maybe our father is not the federal government. The New York Times was opposed to federal spending in disasters in many editorials. They said, well, the editorials, I'm trying to remember which paper said, but, this is not about the all-fathering federal government.
Sure.
Localities should be responsible for their disasters. It wasn't a pure position. Why not? Well, Coolidge sent the Red Cross down, which was affiliated with the government. He sent his commerce secretary to the awful disaster, the Katrina of 1927, Katrina plus, actually. Yeah. Think of tens and tens of thousands of people losing their homes. Yeah. But he was more restrained than others. And what's interesting about that story, he was operating in the Grover Cleveland tradition. We need a dog named Cleveland, don't we? I think, to remind us. I don't. So anyway, around the house, right? Cleveland tradition. So, but then it was kind of like divine retribution. The other lawmakers, the ones who wanted federal spending with the flood of the Mississippi, said effectively, particularly one named Caraway, if this had happened in Coolidge's territory, well, he would have gone right to the flood and sent money, arranged money. If it had happened in his constituency, which would be Massachusetts or Vermont, where he was born, lo and behold, that very year, there was a flood in Vermont, right in the area where Coolidge grew up, and it was a terrible flood. Dozens and dozens of covered bridges were just washed away. When Vermont floods, it's very dramatic. It's a flashy state, as they say, when it comes to water. Think of more recent hurricanes and floods, I believe the lieutenant governor of Vermont drowned getting out of his car. It was not a flood that was in control. It was an incredible disaster. There were railroads all over Vermont. They were washed away. People said Vermont was finished. Should Coolidge go? Should he bid for the Olympics for his place? Should he defend his place? Doesn't he have any heart? That's where he was raised. Coolidge did not go to Vermont. And the Vermonters understood he can't do for his own what he didn't do for others. That's a very strong political principle. It wasn't made up by Coolidge. That's in Edmund Burke.
Yeah.
If you're the president, you're no longer the governor of Vermont. It's awful selfish for you to play to your childhood constituency at whatever cost, because your job is to be president to everyone, not just to Vermont. So what a hard position. I think it was doubly hard because it was towards the end of his presidency. A lot of Vermonters were angry, even if a lot understood. It made him look cold. There's some evidence he looked at aerial pictures of his locale and saw how much of it was washed away, but he didn't believe it was wise for the federal government to get involved. Some principle is a cold comfort when people have been hurt. But he thought in the long run, it would benefit all Americans if the government didn't get in the infrastructure business.
I guess my question here is that if his emphasis, and I know this for kind of these traditional conservatives or Burkean conservatives, is very much reduced government is a claim that's made a lot. I guess my question then would be, if there's a natural disaster or something that happens that might make it very difficult for one state to take care of all of those things. I guess my question would be, what would be, or I guess in Coolidge's mind, what would have been the role, I guess, of the national government then?
One thing that happened, you can see in another crisis he had, which involved the police in Boston, police strike, which foreshadowed Reagan's strike by the air traffic controllers known as Pact, was that they had unrest in Boston when the police went on strike. Coolidge was governor, and by the structure of that state, ultimately responsible. And he called out the state guards of his friends from New England. Other states came. If the Red Cross did play an important role. And the question is whether an aggressive rescuer, the federal government, crowds out natural charity. There's a fabulous book by a guy named David Beito, Beito, not famous enough, called Mutual Aid and the Welfare State. And it's about how people helped each other before the welfare state. And when you hear standard history, historians will say, before Social Security, the federal pension program, there was nothing for old people. That's not quite true. There were mutual aid societies to which they paid a penny every week towards their funeral. There was state help, significant because of that state progressivism we discussed. So it's not as though Americans and even American governments didn't help one another before the Great New Deal, when the federal got in the wholesale business of being in charge of domestic welfare. And what Beito argues is that the federal plunge, the federal giant presence in our daily lives relating to our welfare, crowded out that America that used to exist. And he kind of crucified Alexis de Tocqueville, right? Why do you care about the Rotary if you're going to get a check from payroll protection? Well, the Rotary has some good judgment because it knows the people in the community, and it knows who's always going to ask for money and who's sometimes going to ask for money and then try and find a job. And people do eventually have to find a job. Yeah. That's just the way it is. So all that was going on. But it is a big fallacy in our history when we ignore the incredible extent of community work for communities prior to the New Deal. I would agree that the community was crowded out. Think of when you play Monopoly, community chest actually matters. Yeah. It doesn't anymore. People mock it and joke about it. And that's also because of their affection for progressivism. Always ask someone's agenda when they're making fun of the local. Yeah. Sometimes they have one.
I guess before we get to the end here, I want to ask about foreign affairs. So I don't know if he was weak on foreign affairs or there just wasn't a lot of major conflicts. Again, this is post World War I. How would you say this was a weak area for him, or he just didn't emphasize it?
I wouldn't say it was great. And the reason is Coolidge had a hypocrisy, which was the hypocrisy of his party. That is, he wanted other governments to thrive so that their people could thrive. And he was for tariffs. Mm-hmm. Well, tariffs hurt other countries. If you're Germany trying to recover from World War I and pay your debt to France and your debt to England, well, what do you need to do? You need to export. Mm-hmm. You need hard currency to buy things, other currencies. And what is the number one thing that prevents your exports? Gosh darn tariffs from the same people who are telling you need to get independent. This I consider a massive failure in foreign policy. If you really wanted to argue Coolidge was terrible, which I don't, you would argue on the tariff. Because it just made us look like a bunch of jerks, hypocritical jerks. And the Republicans were for the tariff, the Democrats less. They were for the income tax as a source of revenue. So Coolidge sustained the tariff. The great tariff laws of zero were passed before and after him, no matter. He sustained the tariffs. And he believed tariffs made America stable. Maybe he was right about that. In his view, you have a strike at a factory, say a textile factory, say in Massachusetts, there are famous strikes at factories in the period he was growing up. The employer wants to pay the women who work in the factory more money. What would enable the employer to do that? Well, some protection from competitors from Europe who are making garments there or from somewhere else in the world. So he saw protectionism as a lesser evil, and he was pragmatic in that sense. I'm a free marketeer, so I think it's terrible. But that's my candidate for the worst flaw of Coolidge is his tariff support.
Yeah. So a final question here is that I mean, obviously you said it at the top, which is wanting to try and expose people to the legacy of Coolidge, and so obviously there's an emphasis on his handling the budget. He had the tax cuts of 2020, there was a tax cuts of 24, 26, and 28. He reduced the debt by a third. That's definitely there. We talked about some of the criticisms. Maybe people criticize him for the handling of the flooding. People criticize him for his foreign affairs. I guess just overall, what do you see as a balanced and fair understanding of the legacy of the 30th president?
Well, right now we're in a kind of goofy period, and it is goofy, where we think debt doesn't matter. So if you believe debt doesn't matter, then Coolidge matters less. Sure. But inflation, if anyone's a sailor who's listening to this, inflation is experienced thus. You're sailing beside the peninsula, and there's scarcely enough wind, and you're managing your little craft. And the minute you pass the peninsula, big wind comes, almost knocks you down. As a sailor, you're not prepared for that. That's what inflation is like. One day it's not there, the next day it is. But we know fairly well from bitter experience dating back to Rome that inflation comes when too much money is produced or coins are debased. So one day we'll have some kind of crisis. Maybe there'll be a competitor for the dollar. The Bitcoin is the foreshadowing of that competitor. And all of a sudden we'll have inflation. And then a president who knows how to take measures that reduce inflation will be very much valued. So for the current circumstance, Coolidge doesn't look as valuable in economics as he might at other times. But he does look interesting in terms of foreign policy, because this idea that we can always rescue everyone and we'll always be there for them. You think of Afghanistan, where every year we tell the Afghans and everyone else, one day soon we're leaving. What kind of message that sent, and how unproductive that was, because since they weren't sure we were there for a long period, what a vast difference to our policy, say in Germany, where we said we're here for the duration until you become a stable democracy after World War II. If all we're capable of is we're here through the next election, and we mean the midterm, and then all bets are off, well, that's not very good that is gunboat diplomacy for us or for an Afghanistan. So maybe a more restrained policy, the Coolidge model is important, and another now and couldn't be more timely, I would argue that. Second, Coolidge had took strong positions that offended people and was mocked as a non-Davos type in the period, but he was always civil. He didn't criticize, he didn't negative campaign. You know, he actually said, well, I learned that when you campaign negatively, well, you're giving your opponent too much airtime. He didn't appeal to populism. He just argued his case, and that's very refreshing too. And at the Coolidge Foundation, we do a lot of work with kids, and they like very much his civility. What we do often is have them debate an issue, and they have to argue both sides, and they can't call each other mean names or cancel each other or, you know, frame gotchas for the heck of it to please someone on Instagram, someone they don't even know. Coolidge disdained notoriety. He liked argument, and that's incredibly important in terms of education.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. If there was, it's kind of putting you on the spot, but if there was one question you could ask Coolidge if he was alive, what would you want to ask him, or what's one thing you'd want to tell him, or something like that?
You know, I don't know. Would you have been strong enough during the Great Depression to sustain your conservative policies?
That's a great question.
The answer is some of them probably, but not all. Especially lower, you know, from the point of view of today's low taxers, raising taxes is always bad. But from the point of view of Coolidge land in this gold standard world, sometimes they raised rates on taxes to balance the budget, because the budget was more important in the physics of the system they were operating in. So I'd like to know that. And also, no, that's it. He was actually a very loving man. If you've ever known anyone cold but loving, he was one of those. And he has a wonderful life and a wonderful family. I hope your listeners will come to Plymouth Notch in the summer. It's the most beautiful historic site, well preserved, or to Coolidge House in Washington, which we recently have got the benefit of that too.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. Amity, thank you so much. This was great. Where can people find you? Where can they find your book? Any of the relevant places to get at you?
All the relevant places. I would also mention that with my co-author Matt Denhart of the Coolidge Foundation, lately we republished with the authorization of the copyright owner, the Coolidge family, the President Coolidge's autobiography, which is shorter. Nice. It's the one with President Coolidge throwing a baseball on the cover, if you're looking, because there's some pirate editions. You want him throwing the baseball, and it's got some wonderful ephemera, comments in it. The publisher, Jed Donahue at ISI, did an excellent job with the footnoting and his support for footnotes. So it's a very useful book to give a teenager, and has pictures we've never been able to publish before.
Oh, nice. Very nice.
You can buy, but the one also Coolidge looks happy on the cover, which is important too. He was happy often, and that's little known.
Yeah. Amity, this is great. I appreciate you giving me your time and your brilliance and your energy, and I just can't say thanks enough for doing this.
Well, thank you for the hour. Glad to meet you.
Yes, you as well.